Welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to be your guide today. We're going to dive into a massive 600-year bridge in history, one that literally transformed ancient India into the medieval world. We're talking about the period from 600 to 1200 CE. It's this incredible time of dynamic shifts, massive cultural milestones, and some seriously intense political drama. Honestly, it perfectly sets the stage for the India we recognize today.
So let me ask you this. What actually happens when a massive, completely unified ancient empire just collapses? Because that's exactly where our story kicks off today. You see, after the mighty Gupta Empire fell, the Indian subcontinent didn't just vanish into some dark age. Not at all. Instead, it shattered into these fascinating, highly competitive regional pieces. Political unity pretty much vanished overnight, and in its place, local kingdoms and clan-based power started rising up.
And we're talking about a sheer scale of 600 years here. 6 centuries of dramatic transition, cultural explosion, and fierce rivalries. This era is the vital missing link sitting right between the decline of the ancient Gupta Empire and the eventual establishment of the Delhi Sultanate. And you know, here's a kind of surprising fact. This period is so often unfairly glossed over. People treat it like a chaotic dark age. But in reality, it was one of the absolute most vibrant, dynamic eras in Indian history. The political, economic, and social fabric of the subcontinent was basically entirely rewoven.
All right, let's map this timeline out so we don't get lost. We kick things off around 606 CE. That's when Harshavardhana, a really great ruler of the Pushyabhuti dynasty, begins his reign and briefly manages to unite a lot of North India. Then, moving to 712 CE, we see the first major foreign incursion with the Arab conquest of Sindh. Fast forward a bit to 1192 CE, which is a huge, pivotal turning point with the Second Battle of Tarain. And that directly leads us to 1206 CE, the foundation of the Delhi Sultanate, which definitively ends this early medieval period.
So, here's our roadmap for the explainer today. We're going to break this down into 4 parts: the age of fragmentation, the great tripartite struggle, culture, faith, and temples, and finally, the dawn of a new era.
Let's jump right into part 1. The age of fragmentation and the rise of regionalism. Basically, after powerful early rulers like Harshavardhana passed away, the dream of a unified North India just evaporated. Okay, let's talk about arguably the single most important feature of this entire period: Indian feudalism. Power took a massive shift. It moved away from a central king sitting on a faraway throne down to local lords, who were known as samantas. Kings actually started granting land instead of paying salaries in cash. They'd hand out land to Brahmins, to government officials, to temples, and to these samantas. And what that did was create a completely decentralized system of authority.
So, what did this actually mean for everyday life? Well, it fundamentally changed everything. The samantas basically became the backbone of society. They were the ones providing military support and collecting local taxes. But because they controlled the land on a local level, the central kings became much weaker. And here's the truly fascinating part. Because wealth was now tied strictly to these land grants, rather than vast protected trade routes, internal trade basically collapsed. People had to pivot heavily to agriculture, which sparked this massive ruralization of the economy. The cities actually shrank, and the local villages, they became the absolute center of power and wealth.
That brings us to part 2, the great tripartite struggle, the fight for the North. Because when you have all this localized power, it naturally breeds intense competition.
It's essentially a multi-generational geopolitical Game of Thrones. We've got 3 totally distinct regional heavyweights. Out in Western India, there's the Gurjara Pratihara dynasty. They were famously led by rulers like Mihira Bhoja and were absolutely crucial in defending India from early Arab invasions. Over in Bengal, you have a completely different vibe with the Pala Empire. They were massive patrons of Mahayana Buddhism and bankrolled huge centers of learning like Nalanda University. And then, down in the Deccan, we have the Rashtrakutas. Their architectural genius gave us the breathtaking Kailasa Temple. So 3 incredibly powerful, culturally rich empires standing in massive opposition to one another.
But here's the catch. They all wanted the exact same thing: Kannauj. Kannauj was the ultimate prize. It was the symbol of absolute sovereignty in North India, kind of like Rome or Constantinople in the West. But spending decades upon decades in continuous warfare for control over this single city, it ended up being a fatal mistake. They just exhausted their resources, drained their militaries, and, ironically, completely weakened each other. They basically guaranteed that North India would remain permanently fractured.
So, with those 3 major empires exhausted, a massive power vacuum opened up. and stepping right into that void were the Rajputs. The rise of the Rajput states really became the dominant feature of the 8th century onward in the north and west. They brought a very specific, intense culture with them. We're talking deep clan loyalty, a massive fort-building culture designed for regional defense, and incredibly fierce warfare traditions. You start seeing major dynasties like the Chauhans, the Parmars, and the Chandelas carving out their own fiercely independent kingdoms.
Now let's step away from the continuous warfare of the North for a second, which brings us to part 3, culture, faith, and temples.
Because meanwhile, down in the south, an absolute cultural explosion was taking place. Things were operating on a completely different level down there. The Pallava dynasty, operating out of Kanchipuram, were pioneering these mind-blowing rock-cut temples, like the famous ones at Mahabalipuram. And then you have the mighty Chola dynasty. Under rulers like Rajaraja I and Rajendra I, the Cholas didn't just build monumental structures like the Brihadiswara temple. They expanded massive naval power. And get this, their maritime influence stretched all the way across the ocean to Southeast Asia. It's a stark contrast to the rural, landlocked fort culture we saw developing up north.
But perhaps the most important religious development of this entire era started right here in the south too, the Bhakti movement. Religion was actively shifting. It moved away from incredibly rigid, exclusive rituals and shifted toward this deeply personal, beautifully emotional devotion to a deity. Championed by the Shaiva Nayanars and the Vaishnava Alvars, they made faith accessible, relatable, and deeply personal for the everyday person. It was a real game changer.
And what's really fascinating is how these new regional identities literally took physical shape in massive stone monuments. As regional kingdoms grew wealthier, temple architecture just flourished enormously into 3 distinct styles. Up in the north, the Nagara style dominated. That's known for its curving, mountain-like towers. Think of the stunning Khajuraho temples. Down in the south, the Dravidian style took over, featuring massive pyramid-shaped towers and grand gateways called gopurams. And right in the middle, in the Deccan, the Vaisara style emerged. That was basically a brilliant, deliberate mashup of the two. And these weren't just places to pray. They were the ultimate physical symbols of a regional king's power and wealth.
But inevitably, all that incredible wealth and fierce regional independence attracted outside attention. That brings us to part 4, dawn of a new era, the Turkish invasions.
So we have to ask, how does an era of fiercely independent, well-armed, and deeply entrenched regional kings actually come to an end? Well, remember that feudal system we talked about earlier, the Samantas, and that constant infighting for Kannauj? Yeah. All of that meant that when foreign invaders finally arrived, the subcontinent was incredibly wealthy, but completely, totally politically fractured. There simply was no single, unified army to guard those crucial mountain passes in the northwest.
This all builds up to one of those crazy, history-altering turning points that plays out over just 2 years. In 1191, at the First Battle of Tehran, the famous Rajput ruler Prithviraj Chauhan actually defeats the invading Turkish forces of Muhammad Ghori. Huge victory, right? But just 1 single year later, in 1192, at the Second Battle of Tehran, Muhammad Ghori returns, he adapts his tactics, and this time he's victorious. This singular battle permanently shatters the Rajput defense network in the north.
From there, the dominoes fall incredibly fast. By 1206 CE, the Delhi Sultanate is officially founded. The Rajput kingdoms weaken, Turkish power expands rapidly across the northern plains, and a brand new, highly centralized era begins. Just like that, the 600-year phase of feudal fragmentation officially comes to a close.
I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. It's so easy to look at the collapse of an ancient empire and see the resulting fragmentation as a quote-unquote dark age. But as we've seen today, it was anything but dark. This era gave us the Bhakti movement, the stunning temples of Khajuraho and Brihadiswara, the very regional languages spoken today, and the entire concept of the Rajputs. It really makes you wonder, if the ancient world hadn't shattered into those fiercely competitive regional pieces, would India have ever developed its rich, profoundly diverse cultural identity? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. I really hope this helped you see the absolute brilliant complexity of early